Kill all the leaders, kill the elite. They are the ones who cause it.
Genghis Khan is associated with brutality.
A racist notion, especially out of Europe. And which finger do you have the right to cut off? Even though he was not a Muslim, he protected the right of Muslim tribes. Almost every princess of the Mongols, she had a Muslim partner. When you go up against a country of hundreds of millions of people, you may conquer them, but you're not going to rule them. How on earth can you rule them when you have so few people? His mother was kidnapped, his wife was kidnapped. In many ways, we are more barbaric today than he was in his time.
Religious freedom, merit over birth, and powerful women. You probably don't associate any of that with Chinggis Khan, do you? World-renowned historian Jack Weatherford in this interview explains why you should. Professor Weatherford, it's great to have you here. Even today, one of the most common portrayals of Chinggis Khan and the Mongol Empire, especially in Europe or in the Middle East, is associated with the destruction,
Yes.
with brutality,
Yes.
calamity,
Yes.
even though some historical evidence does not fully support this image. But so why did this perception persist?
Yeah. Well, I think usually when a people lose a war, it's very hard to glorify that leader unless you're connected to that leader. So then we had people such as Amir Timur, who claimed a close connection to the family through both marriage and through his own clan. And so those people greatly protected the image of Chinggis Khan, whereas the more settled people, and the scholars mostly come out of cities and settled people. They're not people of the steppe. Well, what I find the most interesting is, yes, the dominant vision of him was quite negative, but from the beginning, there were great writers who respected him very much. I mentioned already the Persian writer Jawani, who had actually lived in Mongolia during part of that time as a child with his father, so he had seen a lot up close, and he followed the Mongol history very closely. He himself was Sunni Muslim, and he succeeded very greatly under the Mongols. So we have, and he wrote the book about the great Chinggis Khan, the biography, and also of his descendants in Central Asia. But the first writer of the English language, going back to 1300, the first writer was Geoffrey Chaucer. Nobody hardly thinks about it, but one of his stories in his book was about Chinggis Khan. It was a fantasy. It was a fantasy. But he said he was the greatest lord who ever lived. It was a positive fantasy, and it was all about marriage and missing rings and things like that, all magical stuff. But he used the name because it carried a lot of magic of its own, you know. And so he had used, then things changed a little bit in the 1600s. We had a woman, Anne de la Rosquière. She was a French Protestant, a Huguenot, and the king forced all Huguenots to convert to Catholicism or be killed. And many, many, many were killed. But she fled the country, and she fled to Netherlands, and she worked as a servant, teaching children, as a tutor and a nanny to the children. But she wrote a book called Chinggis, in which she said he was the greatest lord whose only vice was too much virtue. And I think the reason, I cannot say, but I think the reason that she was so much in admiration of Chinggis Khan was because she had suffered religious persecution. She had lost everything in her life for her religion. And here was a man who centuries earlier had protected the rights of all religion. So it became somewhat popular. Then soon after her bestseller, by the way, Martha Washington, the wife of George Washington, the founder of the United States, she bought a copy of the book. She gave it to her husband, George Washington. It is still in their home, but I have no evidence he ever read it, unfortunately. A lot of husbands get books from their wives and they don't read it, so I can't say that he did. But there was an interesting connection even to my own country. The book Chinggis was very popular in many different languages. It was French and Dutch and Polish and German. It was just everything. But it inspired a great scholar in French to do a really good biography. His name was Petit de la Croix. He had been a diplomat in Turkey. He understood something about the Muslim world. He knew about the Persian chronicles. He brought all that back and he wrote an extremely good, very long book called Chinggis Khan the Great. And that introduced Chinggis Khan as a great hero. There was no question in his book. It was a great hero. The book was very popular. In America, Benjamin Franklin sold the book. Benjamin Franklin, he was a printer and he ran the post office, and it's like the early version of Amazon. You could order a book and he would send it to you. But so he was a big seller of the book, but the biggest buyer was Thomas Jefferson. And he bought several copies, one of which is still in the Library of Congress today, the original collection. One is in the University of Virginia. He gave one to his granddaughter. So we have these copies and his words about it. So many people found inspiration in the life of Chinggis Khan. But I think the change back away from that was in the Enlightenment. Voltaire wrote a play, and it was actually a play produced during the Mongol dynasty originally, but he changed it a little bit and called it The Orphan of China, in which Chinggis Khan is the barbarian who doesn't know how to appreciate the civilization that he has conquered. And the reason he used Chinggis Khan, it wasn't because of Chinggis Khan. It was because he was afraid, the coward that Voltaire was, he was afraid to criticize the king directly. So rather than criticize his own king, he would set the story way off in a distant land with Chinggis Khan. That turned the attitude somewhat negative. And I will say that also the rise of Napoleon turned the attitude towards conquerors somewhat negative. Even in his later life, Thomas Jefferson stopped mentioning Chinggis Khan. He'd mentioned him a lot early on. And I think in the 19th century was one of the worst centuries for scholarship and for writing about Chinggis Khan. In the 20th century, then we had others come along, such as Nikolai Trubetskoy, later Lev Gumilyov, and others who began, but they weren't being heard. I think in this century, people are ready to hear another version.
What family was Temüjin born into?
The family of Temüjin was extremely unimportant. They were just a very small group of people, even on the steppe where there was a fair amount of poverty. They lived on the edge of all of that. They lived at the edge of a steppe and a mountain area. And so it's not clear that they were really even herding very many animals early on. Hunting was also an important part of their life. They were not a part of the steppe aristocracy, the old clans that had been ruling through various generations and empires. So he was born into a relatively obscure family in almost every way. Some books say that, oh, his father was a Khan and Temüjin wanted to reclaim. No. Even his father, Yasuke, we call him Batar. He was a hero and a warrior, but he was never a Khan, never an important person.
The reason I'm asking this question is I'm trying to understand what aspect of his genealogy allowed him to claim the legitimacy to rule over these Mongol and Turkic tribes.
It was not the legitimacy of his genealogy that gave him the power to rule. It was the legitimacy of the heaven that granted him the power to rule. That's what he claimed, and he made no pretense. He had some Khans in his ancestry, but they weren't particularly important even on the steppe. But he was not destined to inherit that, and he never made much out of it. Part of the reason is because at a very young age, his father was killed. And when his father was killed, all of his father's brothers and cousins and all of the relatives, they threw Mother Erlun and also Sochigel, the two wives of Yasuke Batar, they threw them out. And between them, they had 7 children, the 2 women. They threw them out to die. So he was deserted by his own family. His own clan turned against him, the relative of his father. And they said that to his mother, you are not one that we have to call when it's time to eat. You're not one that we have to respect. So he had no claim. And throughout his life, he turned that into an advantage. He found people, strangers often, who would become loyal to him through his own charisma. So it was his own power that created him, his own power, and his own relatives He never trusted them.
The secret history of the Mongols is the only written source about Genghis Khan written shortly after his death. So how does this text describe his character and how much can we trust it?
Yes. Okay. For me, the secret history of the Mongols is one of the most important documents in history. I think it's very clear when we study it that the earlier part before Chinggis Khan is mostly based upon myth about the blue-gray wolf and the tawny brown deer. Maybe that was the name of an ancestor or just a totem. It's unclear, but it's you read the secret history and you know, and then you get to the life of Chinggis Khan and it begins to pick up in a very realistic way with huge parts missing. It was censored later, I think during the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese, I believe, but it could have been as early as the time of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Chinggis Khan. Great sections were cut out. A few changes were added, sections were removed, but overall, I believe the story, and I believe that it was written by Shigi-Hutuk, a Tatar who was adopted. You know, Chinggis Khan in his early days, he adopted one orphan from every conquered people. And Shigi-Hutuk was the first, actually. And so we have, when the author of The Secret History is speaking, he refers to Mother Erlun as mother. And then he has conversations from inside the ger, the yurt. And so it's obvious that he was a person who was there. When it gets to the war part, Shigi-Hutuk's not very clear. He wasn't a good soldier. He had a few episodes. Chinggis Khan tried to train him. And so the war parts are not very clear. And then when he gets to distant places, like the tribe of Baghdad, well, they knew nothing about the tribe of Baghdad. So you have to judge it carefully. What's right there about Chinggis Khan, his life, his personality, his actions, mostly I trust it. There are one or two exceptions, but mostly I trust that part.
Before Genghis Khan, the Mongol and Turkic tribes have been fighting each other for generations. What exactly did he do to stop this endless intertribal warfare?
Yes, tribal and clan warfare have been going on for probably thousands of years. Sometimes an empire would rise for a while, it would fall. Sometimes there was kidnapping, especially of women, or stealing of animals. Feud would happen between clans. This was going on and on. So Chinggis Khan, the people around him, they lived in a kind of middle area around the Herlun River and also Mount Burhan Khaldun, which was in between the Merkit tribe in the central part of Mongolia, which was a little bit more developed, at that time under Wang Han. On the other side were the Tatar people between them and China. So they were wedged in there. And then at first, Chinggis Khan became allied with Torgel Han, Wang Han, because Wang Han had helped him to rescue Borshta when she had been kidnapped by the Merk. So he owes a great deal of debt to Torgel Han and also to his friend Jamukha. But what happened was Chinggis Khan went out and conquered the people that he was told to conquer, mostly Tatars at first. He went out, he conquered them, he came back, but then he didn't get the recognition, and the next year they would fight the Tatars again. It was sort of a senseless situation for him. So he realized he was conquering, but every time the war would come back the next year. So he made a very radical decision, and that was kill the leaders. Kill all the leaders, kill the elite. They are the ones who cause it. The common people are not causing the war. It's the elite. For the rest of his life, that was his philosophy in war. Kill the elite. Kill off the leaders of the country.
In 1206, there was a great Kurultai, and he was named Chinggis Khan.
Yes.
So, as we know, a very similar ceremony was traditionally used to elect rulers among the Turkic peoples, Turkic tribes. In what ways was the Great Kurultai uniquely a Mongolian tradition? And in what ways was it a continuation of broader steppe tradition?
Mm-hmm. You know, some years earlier, on a lake by Black Heart Mountain in Mongolia, his own followers had proclaimed him as Chinggis Khan, but it was just as a small tribe. And then later, when he broke with the Kariat, with Wang Han, because he wanted his son Jusi Han, or Jusi at that time, Jusi to marry the daughter of Wang Han. Wang Han said no. And the son of Wang Han said basically, he's not qualified to marry a princess. Genghis Khan went and defended his son, and he defeated the Merkid. So after that, now Genghis Khan has all these followers from his own clan, his own tribe. Some of them are with him, some still against him. He has some people from the Kiryat, he has Tatars. So he put them together and he gave them a new name, and that name was Mongol. And he kept the name of Genghis Khan for himself. That was not an old title. You know, Gurkhan was a very famous title on the steppe. The great Khan would be the Gurkhan, but Genghis Khan never claimed that. He just said Genghis Khan, a new title. The meaning, I mean, I can say what I think it means, but it's a little bit unclear. But I think it has, the Mongols, they liked words that had different meanings in different languages, but always good. So for one thing, it was related very close to Tingis and to the sea. And on the other hand, it sounded a lot like the Mongolian word for power and determination. So it was a very good name. And I think that had something to do with the title. I don't know if that's the whole story, but I think it was related.
His great law, the Yasa of Chinggis Khan, it banned kidnapping women, the enslavement of Mongols, and theft of livestock. Where did this kind of legislation come from?
I think that all of the inspiration of Genghis Khan came from his life experience. It was not from ideology. It was not from religion. He didn't just think up, oh yeah, I should outlaw the kidnapping of women. No, his mother was kidnapped. His wife was kidnapped. He went through that. He knew that the violation of one woman was a violation of a whole family, of a whole community, and everybody suffered from that. This is simple. It's not ideology. It's just simple common sense. And this is where most of his law came from. And at first, his laws were just for the people around him, for the Mongol people. And that was the Yasa. And then later, when he began, first the Uyghurs, or Uyghurs of China, they came up and asked to join him, and then the Harlik of this area came to join him. As other people joined with him, then he began to have what they call the Great Law, Yasa, of laws that apply to everybody. And those included religious freedom, no kidnapping of women, no sale of women, all envoys and ambassadors would be protected, and then certain laws for the military, such as that each squad of 10, they had to return with every member, dead or alive. They had to bring every member back. So these were very strong laws that he made for his whole empire. But he allowed each group to keep their own law, as long as it didn't contradict the Great Law, the Yasa.
But was it very different from existing legal tradition in the steppe at that time?
Yes, most of his law within his own tribe, the Yasa, was very much the steppe law. That was clear. And then the other groups, of course, they had their own, mostly steppe law. Yes, but the issue for him in the Yasa, the first law of the Yasa, of which we know, was the law of religious freedom. Okay, that's a much different law, because he saw on the steppe, most of the fighting was either over raiding, kidnapping of women, stealing of animals. He outlawed that. But he saw that in so-called civilized society, people who lived in the cities, that very often it was over religion, of all things. And the first episode he had was when the Uyghurs, the Uyghur people, came to him because they were Muslim, and they had, Gutsluk was their usurper ruler at that time, out of what is now Kyrgyzstan, and he was ruling over them, and he was persecuting Islam. And they came and they said, we will surrender to you if you can protect us. He protected them. They chased down Gutsluk. He ran almost all the way to Pakistan before they caught him. They caught him, they killed him. And then Genghis Khan made the law. Other societies, other rulers have sometimes given freedom to different religions to practice, but this was usually for the organization of religion, for the monks, for the priests, for mullahs, so on. Genghis Khan, what he came up with was unique in all the history of the world. He said every person has the right to their own religion. No one can force them to accept another religion. No one can prevent them from accepting another religion. That was different. It wasn't protecting the monks and the priests, it was protecting the people. And that was one of the reasons he had great loyalty. And even though he was not a Muslim, he protected the right of Muslim tribes from a very early point. Also in this area, he had more animistic people with their shamans. He protected them because they were very close to his own religion. Later, of course, he also protected Christians, and he protected Taoists. He protected almost every religion except the one he never understood was Confucianism. He wasn't sure it was a religion. He never understood what good they did for society, but he didn't persecute them. Religious belief, I think, was very calculated, yes. I think the one for protection of women and envoys came out of his practical experience. But the one out of religion, in a way, it's out of his practical experience, but it's really not protecting anything that's of great personal interest to him, but it makes many, many people loyal to him. So I think, yes, there was more of a political decision. Again, it's not an ideological decision like, oh, all people are children of God. He did believe that, but that's not the source of the belief. He believed that every group of people, they had a religion and they should stick to the religion of their fathers and their mothers. And the great sky was the one ruler over everything in the world, Tenggis. But he himself did not try to change anyone's religion. His grandson, Mongol Khan, I think, expressed it very well, that the different religions of the world are like the different fingers of God. And which finger do you have the right to cut off? And I think that may have come from Chinggis Khan, but it's given to us from his grandson, Mongol Khan.
What about the beliefs of Chinggis Khan himself, the religious beliefs?
Mm-hmm. Early in life, his worship was of the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun and of the sky above, the eternal blue sky. He was very concerned, and I think he was well trained about the spirits around him in the earth and in the various rivers, but his mother was not from there, and his father was not there anymore. So he didn't have a lot of that training, but he had some because he interacted a lot with Uriankrai people, and they were the ones who I think helped to teach him about the sacred mountain. But then the problem for him became a little bit, when they got away from there, then there are other mountains and other rivers, and you didn't know how to pray to them, and you didn't know their power or their value. And so it became a little bit more difficult. And so gradually over time, he shifted away from the mountain. Always was his personal sort of spirit and protector, always. But for the empire, then he began to stress the great blue sky, Munkochtingers, the great blue sky, but also every time he uttered those words, he also said the great Mother Earth. People forget somehow often about the great Mother Earth, but he always blessed the eternal blue sky and the great Mother Earth.
Can we say that Islam became an inherent aspect of the Mongol Empire and its successor states?
We can say that outside of some areas. I mean, you can say that for all of Central Asia, for the Middle East, because Islam was already there in those areas. In China, he had a lot of impact with Islam because, Chinggis Khan, in recognizing each religion, he recognized that each religion had something to offer. For example, he thought the Taoists were pretty good with medicine, but he thought Muslims were the best in arithmetic, mathematics, and these sciences. So he brought many, many Muslims to China to serve as engineers, to serve as administrators, tax collectors. Often the tax collectors are hated in every country, of course. And so he brought many of them there, but that remained very much a mixed country. And he probably, in his lifetime, Chinggis Khan favored more Taoism within China over the others, but he gave all of them the equal rights. And then the time of Kublai Khan, he was able to mix and really put one religion against another much more effectively than his grandfather had done. But certainly throughout Central Asia, Islam became the main voice of the Mongols. Then Russia, remained Christian, and a few of the Mongols converted to Christianity. Now, the Mongols in Mongolia, they did not convert. No, because today Mongolia is mostly Buddhist. There's a tendency to want to say that Genghis Khan favored Buddhism. I don't see the evidence for that. Then they say, well, Kublai Khan favored Buddhism. Kublai Khan's mother was Christian, and he was very familiar with that tradition. He was not interested in being a Christian. He was interested in being a Mongol, and he used the religions one against the other. But certainly in Central Asia, I think what was important was when the Mongols came in, say, for the Ilkhanate in Persia, in Iraq, and in that area, they did give equal rights to all the different branches of Islam. And especially at that time, Sufis were often persecuted. And the Mongols liked the Sufis. There was an attachment with them, I think in part because of the more spiritual aspect of Sufism, as opposed to a lot of Muslim scholars who are very scholarly and academic. They are more spiritual. So, yes, Islam in Central Asia, and then all into India, and all became the dominant religion of the Mongols, yes, but not Mongolia.
We know that in 1241 they reached Vienna and Europe was in panic. Why did they not advance any further?
Mm-hmm. The standard reason given was the death of a Gudai Han, and that everybody raced back, which is true. They did race back for the Hurultai. But the fact is, after the Hurultai, they increased their warfare by invading further into China, by deeper into Central Asia, into the Middle East. They were not very interested in Europe because, in my opinion, it wasn't just because of a Gudai Han. They could have come back there like they did the other places. No, two things. I think one was a geographic and environmental factor. Mongols liked an open area to move. The horses, for example, the army moved as a great wave in two wings. And of course, when you get to these sedentary societies, you have to move on a road. Well, that was not very good for the Mongolian army. Also, you cannot cross the countryside because their crops are out there, but they also have ditches for irrigation. The land has been plowed up. It's not good for the horse. It's very difficult. So Europe, first of all, was environmentally challenging. I would say the same way India was south of the Indus River, environmentally challenging for different reasons, but similar. So that was part of the answer. But the other is they had seen the world. They had seen China. They had seen the edge of India. They had seen Persia and Baghdad. They had seen Russia. They'd seen Europe, Western Europe. Western Europe had nothing to offer. It had no great wealth. It was nothing. It had some skills. The only skill was some in mining and metalwork. Otherwise, they had just nothing compared to the great wealth of Persia, of Baghdad, of India. These were the richest places, the Khwarezm Empire in Central Asia. The Mongols knew value. Western Europe had little value compared to all the other areas around them.
Chinggis Khan, he was known to be illiterate, but nevertheless, he adopted a writing system for Mongolian language and built a complex administrative system. How did he manage to do this?
Yes. I can only speculate. I can't really answer the question. But I think about it, and if you compare him to, say, a great conqueror such as Alexander the Great or Suleiman the Magnificent, these were people who conquered a lot, not nearly as much as Genghis Khan, but they already came into a society that had written language, it had an organized army, it had an organized financial system, it had an organized government. Genghis Khan had none of that, absolutely none of that. And so he asked the Uyghurs to develop a written language for them. He built the army itself on the basis of earlier Turkic military systems. So he did have a predecessor, but he had to make it again from the beginning. He didn't inherit an army. He just got the idea from these predecessors. So he had to create all of this. And he had to create the system of laws. And he appointed Shigi Hutuko as the supreme judge of the country. Every law had to be written, he was very specific, in blue books. Every law had to be written in a blue book. And the supreme judge would be Shigi Hutuk because he was the best scholar. Supposedly, he told his sons they all had to learn to read and write. I never have any evidence that they did. His daughter, Alakai Bek, however, we do have the Chinese reports because the Chinese were astounded. This woman reads and writes, and she's always reading and writing. What's going on? But they didn't tell us which language. I assume it was Mongolian, using Uyghur script, but I don't know. So he did this, I think, based on common sense. But one advantage he had, okay, if you're Alexander the Great, then you already inherit this Greek system in your head. If you're Suleiman, you already inherit this Muslim system of organization. All of them had something, but Chinggis Khan had nothing. Therefore, he could choose bits and pieces from everywhere. So when he used the Turkic model, for example, for the army, and then he decided to use the Muslim administrators out of Central Asia to help with the bureaucracy and to build that, he pulled in people from everywhere and they helped him to assemble. One of his greatest talents was to find talent and to use it to his advantage. Never to think that he's the best warrior, he's not the best strategist, he's not the strongest with a bow and arrow, no. He always found the best, always.
One of the most fascinating things about Chinggis Khan is that up until 19th century, his lineage remained one of the most important sources of political legitimacy. We know that the right of Kazakh Khans or the Khans of Bukhara to rule, for instance, rested on their direct descent from Chinggis Khan. So why was this such a powerful political claim?
Chinggis Khan left a great reputation, both a negative reputation. There were many Persian scholars, for example, who wrote the most horrible things about him. The Russian didn't write about him very much at that time, but they made comments in the chronicles in Kiev. And there were very negative comments that were there. But on the other hand, we always had some who were very positive, such as the Persian writer Jovani at the time, whereas another one, Juxjani, he was very negative. So whether it was negative or positive, he was the most famous. And I would argue that he was the most famous person of that era anywhere in the world. And his success was so outstanding, whether you attributed it to his intelligence and genius, or you said, no, it's because he was the meanest, roughest barbarian on earth. He had the reputation, and everybody wanted part of that power. It seemed that there was some power from heaven or from somewhere that was running through his lineage. And so it became popular, and I don't know that all the people who claimed descent from him actually had it. But I would say the only more famous person in that era would have been the prophet. That's the only one.
What was Pax Mongolica, and what did trade and travel look like in the empire at its height?
Yeah, Pax Mongolica just means, of course, it's a Latin phrase for the peace of the Mongols. We talk about the war. But first of all, Chinggis Khan's own Mongol army was about 100,000 soldiers. Later, as other Turkic groups joined him, it grew about 100,000 soldiers. The Mongol nation that he ruled in Mongolia, what's now Mongolia, that nation was about 1 million people. When you go up against a country of hundreds of millions of people, China alone had over 1 million soldiers at that time. Okay, you may conquer them, but you're not going to rule them. How on earth can you rule them when you have so few people? And every time he conquered a city, he couldn't leave his soldiers behind. He couldn't say, okay, you go and rule that city. No, he had to depend on those people. And so he would find allies. And so people began to be attracted to him. Those who fought him died. If you fought against him, he killed your elite. If you had any trade, he kept you. If you could make almost anything, if you could make a pot or translate a book or anything, he would keep you. But the elite, he always killed off. And so then he created this system, and it's got to have benefit for everybody. So he knew how to use minority people. He knew how to use religions and bind them together by giving all of them freedom that they didn't have often in their own country originally. Another thing that he did was he did not tax them heavily. If they surrendered, they lost nothing. They surrendered voluntarily, they all lost nothing. They just had to pay the tax to him that they were already paying. If they fought against him, he destroyed the city, took everything from it. But the people who joined him, they benefited tremendously. And we look back at the record and say, oh, the Mongols are such barbarians, they didn't even know the importance of the irrigation system and they let it be destroyed. No, the Mongols destroyed the irrigation system. They chose to destroy it for a good reason. First of all, to destroy it takes as much work as to build it. But they knew that irrigation changed pasture land for animals into agricultural land. They wanted more land for animals, so they went back to that system. He destroyed some cities because he thought they were just parasites on the Silk Route. They had no function other than to rob, steal, and to charge taxes. So he created a new system, and he operated with the Yam system, in which they set up relief places with animals and food for merchants, for traveling ambassadors, envoys, for everyone. He created this giant postal system all over the empire, and he protected the rights of merchants. He raised the status of merchants. They were often looked down upon almost like prostitutes or something very low, beggars. No, he raised the status of them. And where in the Muslim world, where they already had a fairly high status compared to the Chinese world, where it was very low, they became very loyal to him. But I think in the end, it wasn't the policy itself, it was the fact that policies worked. So goods were coming in from China into the Central Asia and the Middle East that had never been there before. The steel out of Damascus was going into China, had never been there before, along with the tiles that were made in Central Asia. The great horses out of Central Asia everybody was benefiting. As long as they benefited, the Pax Mongolica survived. People wanted it to go on. It ended after about 100 years, or from the life of Genghis Khan, I'd say 150 years. But from the Chinese perspective, it's usually 98 years. They don't want to give it a full 100, 98 years. And it ended, but I think it ended primarily because of the plague. The plague was carried out of somewhere in East Asia, and it arrived in Europe. And so then the whole system began to deteriorate as the plague spread and people closed their cities. If you remember, COVID was a time when everything closed down, and that happened. And I think that's the real end of Pax Mongolica.
Was it because the Mongol trade system, road system, I'm talking about the spread of Black Death?
Yes, yes. You know, every good thing in life has an underside, something bad. And so all this movement of people back and forth so quickly, and animals back and forth so quickly, messages could go from Hungary to Mongolia in 6 weeks. It was incredible. So that gave opportunity also for negative things to move. It wasn't just trade and tile and steel and silk. It was also germs. And the germs actually, for the plague, they do not travel on horses or camels. So they had to come somehow in packaged goods, or perhaps there were mice or other things in the goods that were being somehow it spread, not by way of the animals, but somehow it spread. Yes, so the great system that it created caused its own downfall. And I think about today, I see, boy, we have this communication systems of planes everywhere. We live in a world of chaos. There's an underbelly of problems that come with all of this.
Why do you describe his era as the birth of the modern world rather than just another great empire?
To my knowledge, no one had ever been from Europe to China, and no one had ever been from China to Europe before Genghis Khan. After him, The two were never out of communication of some sort. I think the life of Marco Polo is one of the best examples. That was in the time of Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan. But first of all, Marco Polo's father and uncle had already been from Venice in Italy all the way to Beijing, around China, all the way back to Venice. They picked up Marco. They went all the way back again. That's in one lifetime. These two men made 2 trips back and forth. And Marco made, of course, one epic trip that's still recorded. So people were in contact. That book alone from Marco Polo gave the European, they called it A Million Lies. They couldn't believe that a society could be as civilized as the Chinese. It just couldn't be, and it could be much bigger than Europe and greater. And no, they couldn't believe it. It was all, but it gave them so many new ideas, spreading the ideas about the use of paper money, for example, and all of these things. So I think that was the beginning. The other part, go back to the Ikyasa that we had mentioned, with protect the envoys, religious freedom, protect women. Almost every country has in their constitution or in their law some similar law. But the truth is, it's in the law, but it's not followed. We cannot say that women are no longer trafficked in the world. They're probably trafficked more than before. We cannot say that all envoys and ambassadors are safe in the world. They are attacked, they are kidnapped, they are killed. We cannot say that there's religious freedom everywhere in the world. Almost everywhere, there seems to be some group that's persecuted or looked down upon, and in many cases, they are still killed or exiled today. So we have achieved none of those things. So in some ways, we still haven't achieved the modern world that Genghis Khan envisioned. We're still trying to get there. And it reminds me of another saying from his grandson, Mung Khan, which again may have been from Genghis Khan, I'm not sure, but it described Mung Khan. And he said, you people, talking about the Christians, the Muslims, the Jews, the Buddhists, the Taoists, said, you people have written scriptures, and you have scriptures and books to follow. He said, we have shamans and drums to follow. You don't follow your books. We follow the drum and the shaman. And I think there's something to that. Genghis Khan enforced his law. It was real. Today, we have laws all over the place. Oh, we're going to protect the environment, or we're going to protect this, or we're going to protect that. Oh, just laws, laws, laws. And programs and policies and meetings. And the truth is, in many ways, we are more barbaric today than he was in his time. The society was more humane in many ways then than now.
If we're talking about that, he created the system of global trade, the first system of global trade. Did the world become richer or poorer after his conquest?
Yes. Now, I credit him personally only with that unification across the land. So it was, the Silk routes had already been there, but he revitalized them, he eliminated some, and he made sort of like superhighway silk routes across it. He did everything to promote trade. The Mongols, the Mongols did not produce anything. I mean, Mongols they could not weave, even to this day. They have trouble, they don't produce pots. There are many things they can't produce, but they knew the value of trade. They had to get things from one place to another. So they greatly increased the trade across the land in their time. Now, 2 generations later, Kublai Khan, then he was cut off from Persia by the tribes of Central Asia, his own relatives. His own relatives were against him. They didn't like that he was too Chinese. They didn't like many things about him. They fought sometimes. Sometimes they didn't fight. The trade was disrupted. And so he had to go out to sea in order to communicate with his loyal part of his family from his brother Huligu in Persia, in the Ilkhanate. So they went out to sea. And in fact, the first convoy from China, Marco Polo sailed home on that. His life is interesting to me because he wanted to go to China by sea. And they left Venice, they crossed the Mediterranean, they went to Hormuz, a place still important in the world today, went to Hormuz, and the ships were not good enough. So they had to cross by land. But by the time 17 years later, Kublai Khan had a good enough navy. It took 2 years to do the whole trip, but they came by sea all the way back to Hormuz, and then across the land, and then across the Mediterranean, and back home. So the Mongols had created not just the land route, which had already been there, and they revitalized it, improved it, but they created also, they united these little sea routes along the way into one massive system.
You have already mentioned that they created the postal system from China to Europe. Could you explain to us how did it work in practice and who benefited from it?
Okay, the postal system was first created primarily for the military. That was the original objective, because we mentioned Genghis Khan had ordered the creation of a written language using Uyghur script, but that was for the law. He did not allow soldiers to use written language for messages. It was a very interesting thing. So here you are, for example, in Hungary, you have something to report back to Mongolia, and it cannot be written. So the Mongols developed this oral system of how they would report the things that needed to be reported. So they had an oral system, and it had to pass from one person to the next. And so they would start off on the postal system, and they would run, it varied with the terrain and the environment, but somewhere around maybe 25 kilometers per day, there would be another postal system, sometimes a little farther or a little closer, depending on. And then they would give the same message in the same oral form to the next person, and then they would get fresh horses, and the next person would take the fresh horses and go on, and the postal system continued like that. That was original, mostly for military messages. But he also extended it then to merchants because the merchants were very closely affiliated with the royal family. Mostly it was the women of the royal family who managed distribution of merchandise. Almost every princess of the Mongols, she had a Muslim partner. They're called ortok in the Mongolian. The ortok, they handled the trade. So it was almost official, but there was merchandise and not government property. So it was moving back and forth on this same system. So it changed from a military system into a system based primarily on commerce. And that's how it was for most of the rest of the empire. But then over time, it got smaller and smaller, and some pieces were dropped out in different countries. But it did persist in Mongolia all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. But then it was only a postal system once again.
Can we say that after Chinggis Khan's death, his empire was held not so much by his sons, but also with the women of the empire?
Yes. I think the first goes back way before Chinggis Khan, and that is in steppe tribes, women had to be important. She's not going to always have a man right there to take care of everything. He's off with the animals sometimes 3 months, or he's off raiding or fighting, and she may go for a couple of years without seeing him. So women were running the domestic household. They were often organizing the flocks, running that with their children. Women were very involved. They had to make decisions. They had to talk to people coming. So that was already existing in his society. But his country was so small. With 1 million people, you can't say, okay, well, that half has to stay home and do nothing while the men are out conquering. No, so he had to use the women to help administer the empire. When he went away, his wives and his daughters would administer all the different parts of the land that had been in Mongolia and all the surrounding area, including this area and much of China, northern China, western China. All that was being administered by first by his wives, then by his daughters. But then there was a change, and that is, in addition to having very capable daughters and wives, he chose extremely capable wives for his sons. They always had some political wives who were just chosen for political purposes. They always had some wives perhaps they chose for preference, but he made sure each one had one smart woman, usually who could read and write. And so Ogüde Khan was the first example of where, in his old age, his wife Dorichin, she began to do more and more to run the country. And she also used women who came out of Central Asia from Khwarezm, from that empire. She used women as her main counselors. And then when a good day finally died, then she ruled as the regent for 5 years. This is the largest empire in the history of the world ever ruled by a woman, was under Dorjin. And then, unfortunately, she gave it to the son that she liked the most. Anyway, he was not the most capable, and he only lasted in office 18 months. He was fighting all the time earlier in life, even from childhood practically. He'd been fighting with his cousin Batu Khan and also Buri Khan. Buri Khan was on his side fighting against Batu Khan. And so he was a mess. Even his father called him one time a rotten egg, and he only ruled 18 months. And then, unfortunately, his wife, Ogul Hamish, she was not as capable as her mother-in-law, Dorjin. And so then at that time, Soraktani Bek, the mother of Chinggis Khan and Mongol Khan, and Batu Khan, they decided that the descendants of Kutai Khan and Chagatai could not rule anymore. They made this decision, and I respect both of them for it. Soraktani wanted power for her sons, so that's just sort of straightforward. She wanted her son Mongol Khan. But Batu Khan, I think we owe him special respect because he should have been the great Khan. He was the oldest grandson. He was the most capable. I can't say he was more capable than Mongol Khan, but the two of them were the most capable. He was very capable, but he knew that because of the antagonism with Chagatai's family, and also to some extent with the Guday's family, he would not be able to rule the empire. So he put his support behind Mongol Khan. I think most people who are passed over to become the emperor, the great Han, they would fight for it. But he sacrificed that, and he chose to remain as great Han of the Golden Horde, but he created the next generation of leaders. So anyway, the women at this point, they were still very important, but they were quickly losing importance. And then by the end of the third generation, they had lost most of their importance. Kublai Khan, he did depend a lot on his wife, Chabi, who was Mongolian. He depended a lot on her, but after her, there was no really great woman again, the way Soraktani and Dorjin and all had been before.
Talking about Genghis Khan, nobody knows where he was buried. Why did they hide his burial place?
Okay, speak of such things is very delicate in Mongolia. We should not say too much because Genghis Khan said, "Let my body go, let my nation live." And so he didn't want glorification. He never allowed a portrait of him to be made. He never allowed a statue. He never allowed a building to be named for him. He never allowed, some coins were actually minted with his name on it, but it was done without his acknowledgement. They assumed he wanted it. But certainly his portrait was never on a coin, nothing like that. And he wanted to just return to the nature where he was born. It was just that simple. And he and all of the great Hans of the Mongol Empire disappeared like that. They almost all were buried in the same place together, except only Ogode Han and Guik Han were buried more out this way, somewhere in the Altai. We don't know where exactly, but they were buried. The rest were taken to rest back in near his home where he was born in Mongolia. No statue, no building, nothing. Later, I will say Kublai Khan did build a very small building there. But what he did was they made it the great forbidden land. Nothing could be done there. You could not chop down a tree. You could not kill an animal. You could not make a road. You could not build a building. And it was surrounded by protectors all the way around. So in a way, that's the greatest honor any human can have, is to just leave their homeland the way it was when they were born, protect the environment. It's still protected.
There's a famous myth that almost 1 in every 200 men on earth is descended from Genghis Khan. Is there any truth behind this?
Well, I like your earlier word there, myth. Yes, it's one of our scientific modern myths. The science is accurate in the sense that there's a certain amount of kinship among people, males in this case. It was only among males, especially throughout Eurasia. So there's some kind of descent. And they assume that it was Chinggis Khan. They have no DNA of Chinggis Khan, none. And then some people say, well, this is a descendant. Okay, maybe that was a descendant. Maybe it was an adopted person. Maybe we don't know. So this was a hypothetical, and it came out maybe 20 years ago now, or 15 years ago, quite some time ago. And I think there was no evidence other than they had some connection. And so let's say Chinggis Khan. He was the great man of the millennium. It must have been him. But as far as from what I understand, I don't understand science at all. I can't do a thing with science. But my understanding is actually it all points out a little earlier than Chinggis Khan. I do think it's in the Turkic-Mongol world, this connection. But I don't think there's any one person we can say exactly. The thing about Chinggis Khan and his descendants is, if you have a child from the great emperor, it's going to be known. Now, I think part of this is a racist notion, especially out of Europe, that the Mongols were always raping our beautiful women. They're so desirable by everyone in the world. But there's no evidence. There are claims that the Mongols did it, but there's no evidence. There's no one person that they can produce out of their history. I don't doubt it happened in some cases, but the emperor, he doesn't need to go around doing such things. I don't think that happened at all. He had always 4 wives. They traveled, one was always with him. She traveled with him always. And I think every descendant is very clearly in the record.
Today, Mongolia is a small country with a population about 3 million people. How do Mongolians themselves remember and understand this history?
For the people of Mongolia, I'm not Mongolian, so I just give my observation. I don't speak for them, but they worship him as the founder of their country and as the father of their nation in every way. And so he is the greatest hero of history. And even Time magazine out of the United States named him the greatest man of the last millennium. So I've never met a Mongolian who had anything negative to say about him. They respect him tremendously. Sometimes I wish they would follow his example more. In some ways, you could say he was the richest man in history. He conquered the most, he had the most wealth. Other ways, you could say he was the poorest emperor in history because he gave everything away. He said, I eat the food my soldiers eat. I sleep on the ground the way my soldiers sleep. I wear the same clothes my soldiers wear. I live the life of a Mongol. And I think that's very important. So he created that nation, and they respect him infinitely, and they honor him in every way. But I also wish that everyone could follow his example more.
How do modern Mongolians regard other states and nations whose political consolidation happened, among other things, thanks to the legacy of the Mongol Empire?
Yes. It's ironic that Mongolia itself is so poor when other areas such as China, Kazakhstan, Russia, even Iran, even though they would deny it there, and India, all of them benefited from these laws of Chinggis Khan. Even the places where he didn't conquer, such as India or South China, which were conquered by his descendants. But the Mongols, they just, I think for the most part, take that as part of the greatness of Chinggis Khan, and they don't resent it too much. They recognize that any failure is their own failure. There are times when they've been repressed, of course, repressed by the Manchu, for example, in China, repressed to some extent under socialism by Soviet Union. But they also see today that other people were repressed as much or more, and those people are very successful. And I think for the most part, the Mongolians have a generous enough heart that they're happy for those other people, and they recognize that many of their problems come from within their own society. They're very practical people, very practical in their view of the world. And of course, I love Mongolia very much. You know, I came to Mongolia and to Kazakhstan in 1998. I was already 52 years old, too late to learn new things. But I fell in love with this place, with the beauty, with the mentality. And I think that the tribal people, the nomadic heritage has been eclipsed for the last 500 years. Once the Ottomans left the steppe and settled in Turkey, the descendants of Amir Timur settled down and became the Mughal dynasty of India. Once all these things happened, only Kazakhstan and Mongolia remained true to the spirit of the nomads. But it was the backwater. Now everything was moving by ship. Few things were going by camel anymore. The nomadic people were forgotten. They were just a part of history. It became nostalgia, stories from grandmother, things like that. But in this century, I believe that we're going to rediscover that heritage, because we may work in our small garden of a room where we have a computer and a few books and all, but as soon as we open the computer, as soon as we pick up the phone, we enter cyberspace. That's just one more step, this great cyber step out there. And it's the mind of the nomad that knows how to navigate in new spaces. To succeed in this century, everyone has to become a nomad in their mentality, a nomad on the cyber step. So this is why already we see in the first quarter of a century, the rise of Kazakhstan as a major power, as a major financial player in the world, as people who, they're not conquering anything. They don't have to go out and do that. They don't quite have the K-pop influence, but online they have a great presence in the financial system of the world. It comes, they're not nomads themselves in the sense of their grandfathers or great-grandfathers, but there's a mentality that's already built into the culture, built into the language, built into the spirit of the people. This will be the millennium in which the mind of the nomad becomes the mind of the new world. And you can see the world needs a new mind.
Professor, thank you very much. I must admit you're an amazing storyteller. And thank you very much for your contribution to historiography, to science, and it was an honor for me to talk to you, and I'll be happy to share your knowledge with our audience.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your audience to listen to me go on with my opinions. But I love this area very much, and even if I say something wrong, I love this place very much.
Thank you, Professor.